Hey everyone. I am hosting a catch-up call this morning because there have been a lot of updates, both within the Forbes funds, but also just within our ecosystem. And so kind of holding space this morning for you to ask questions directly regarding some of our, recent successes, but also like what is happening around federal government, whether that's Supreme Court decisions or results from the debate last week. So I really just wanted to open that at the Southwest PA region level. So if there are things that we can be providing as resources, updates, conversations, I mean, especially with the um, Supreme Court decision around housing policy falling to cities and whether or not homelessness or encampments can be broken up in the Grants Pass versus Johnson case, or whether or not expert counsel can be sought with the Chevron defense ending. So there are a lot of really point in time specific concerns and questions that I've heard from in the last couple of days, even from members. And so just kind of creating a space to ask your questions this week, and then we'll be following up next week on bringing in some additional experts or perspective to address those for everyone. I also want to spend a little bit of time this morning sharing our AI for Social Impact cohort success last Wednesday. Thank you to Community Living and Support Services for hosting a wonderful gathering. We saw over 90 participants attending, and I think there were 60 some registered. And so that just goes to show, prioritizing time that morning, how many people really wanted to hear about what was happening with the Forbes funds and Mad Labs. So with that, I'm really hoping that this is kind of an informal call for community solutions, just like a weekly check-in. And then if you have any questions or items that are coming up as I'm going through the various topics, please add them to the chat and I'll be sure to address them. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and get started. So for those folks who are new to these conversations, the Forbes Funds hosts these each Monday morning from 10 to 11 a.m. And these originated as a call for community solutions, but also kind of community update in a really uncertain time. And that was March 2020 of the COVID-19 pandemic. Since that time, we've hosted 5,242 Zoom meetings with 44,812 participants across the Forbes Funds ecosystem. And these Monday calls are really a chance to have, ecosystem updates, of course, but also to highlight really great work that's happening in Southwest PA and beyond to see how we might work better or smarter, not harder. The frameworks that the Forbes Funds has adopted since that time include the social determinants of health and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And while we are reverse engineering our own outputs to these goals, we're also encouraging others to look at them as ways that we might use common language and metrics as we're looking to partner differently and more successfully with each other across the nonprofit sector, but even beyond for cross-sector partnerships. So for example, looking at quality education or gender equality, there are so many organizations that I know have programs under a broader mission that align with those two sustainable development goals. So rather than focusing on, only mission alignments for organizations, how might we encourage collaborations that get down to the leader level for that transformative leadership framework that we've been moving towards, but also the program level so that we can continue promoting the best practices taking place in this region. And the second, for social determinants of health, we found that this is a more accessible language model to adopt first before getting into the very specific indicators of the social or of the sustainable development goals, because there are it's broader language and it's easy to make the case for something that can fit into improving neighborhood and built environment between partnerships and programs. And so just using those as the kind of reverse engineered, how are we moving forward? And what are we moving forward to align with? And then the third framework is the 8 Rs, or the 8 returns, as Fred calls them. Everything from return on assets to return on well-being is the how of our work. So if you think of the sustainable development goals and the social determinants as the what, and the day-by-day pieces, the Rs are how we do that work. So are we aligning to better support gender equality outcomes because we are leveraging our assets that could support another organization? Are we leveraging an investment that we've made as far as matching funds? Are we leveraging policy that we're collectively advocating for? And so just breaking this down in terms of, ways to partner with the Forbes funds and leverage that language, I like to reiterate that each Monday morning for anybody who's new to the call. So we're going to jump into it. I'll be hosting the conversation this morning, but I do want to invite anyone to ask questions or unmute to jump in. So for last Wednesday, the pilot cohorts that we started for the AI for Social Impact purpose really began about 5 years ago, even though we just piloted in April. Olivia, Fred, and Adam from the Mad Labs team and Kit had started conversations about 5 years ago on humanity-centered design versus human-centered design. And the way that I hear that difference is human-centered design is how we can, best leverage the expertise and the perspectives of the folks who are in the room at this point in time to do a strategic plan or a specific objective, right? Humanity-centered design, and Fred spoke about this last Wednesday, and I hope he'll share some more words of wisdom along this line today. But the purpose of humanity-centered design is figuring out how we can best leverage our unique gifts, skills, and talents towards that collective purpose. So it's not just the folks who are in the room. It's not just the folks who are, currently present for your programs. It is how can we take an entire ecosystem lens and focus it, taking into account the gifts, skills, and talents, the most vulnerable and resilient members of this population. And so looking at the work of nonprofit organizations and the fact that we serve many of those individuals, we are uniquely poised to be the experts in this space. And I think there's a lot of folks that are surprised to hear that, 12 nonprofit organizations and the 35 leaders within those organizations who have participated in these pilot cohorts are ahead of 85 to 90% of for-profit professionals leveraging AI within their own sector. But that is the result of this cohort. And so figuring out how we can tie together the humanity-centered lens that many of these nonprofit employees live day to day in their own work, but also with the emergent technology of artificial intelligence became the question about 3 years ago, and where the digital availability of these humanity-centered design resources from Mad Labs and the beginning plans for this cohort really took form. And I want to share at the midpoint of this cohort about 4 weeks ago, participants completed an assessment. And before I get into the nitty-gritty pieces of what each cohort does, I want to share some of the results because they were actually astounding and much more impactful than I had even anticipated participating in each one of these sessions. So in terms of time savings, each participant in the cohort estimated that they saved 4 to 10 hours of work per week by participating in this cohort and leveraging artificial intelligence. And that was across all 3 cohorts. In a year, that would amount to about 20 days of work per year. And this is an average. There were some folks who estimated it was much higher than that. And that's hours to days conversion. So that's not even 20 work days. It's 20 days worth of hours. And that's pretty significant for folks who are so overburdened in terms of the demand that we see in our day to day, but also under-resourced in the way that we're going after different sources of funding to be able to continue this work. And so thinking about how much time could be saved on the administrative tasks, often administrative tasks, I will say, that AI can save you time on, it is imperative to start adopting these ways of thinking and working. Adam says it really well, and he shared this last week as well. And he said that a lot of the folks that we are working on behalf of don't have the opportunity to work smarter, not harder, or to leverage these technologies in the way that we can. And so we almost have the responsibility to do so on their behalf. So some of the specific tasks that we found folks using AI most for were writing, administering tasks or follow-ups from meetings, generating ideas or research, which is kind of the design thinking piece, which I'll get into in a little bit, note-taking and developing strategies that are broader than a specific program and often organization-wide. However, we also found that when the time was saved on those tasks and we followed up to say, how are you repurposing this time? It is spent building relationships, deepening communication, or being more specific in the outreach or, next steps that we're drafting and thinking about the bigger picture. And that is exactly that's the benefit of participating in these cohorts, because when you have time to take the administrative tasks or the need to do tasks off the table, or shorten the amount of time that you're spending your energy or work hours on those, you have more time to form deeper connections with the people around you in your organization. You can be more creative in your time that you're spending with them as you're ideating or building designs. Um, and you're also spending less time just kind of having that energy pulled, because they're the tasks that are not necessarily in alignment with like your soul calling, right? I remember 2 summits ago in 2021, Dr. Kathy Humphrey referred to a call to work in this sector as like a soul calling. And I find that to be the case with a lot of folks who are nonprofit practitioners and leaders. So um, one of the things I do want to call out is a quote from one of our participants that said, service workers will not be replaced by AI." That's huge, because that's kind of the competing narrative that we've been hearing alongside the conversations promoting these cohorts. And the reason I want to call that out is because if you think about one professional with that humanity-centered lens, focused on the most resilient members of our community, leveraging 12 AI tools expertly, that person is much more hireable and competitive and efficient than a single AI tool that is built to do one thing efficiently. And so that's kind of the other case that we're making for especially cohorts 1 and 2, is to really just take the first step and get comfortable utilizing these tools, because our ability to be effective and efficient, yes, but also competitive in the emergent economy is really dependent on our ability to take that first step. So cohort 1, I'm sure many of you have heard of this a few times, but I got some really nice feedback from folks who are cohort 1 participants and interested in joining the next round of cohorts last week, that I kind of want to reframe very briefly. So I mentioned the strategic humanity-centered design frameworks. There are 30 different human-centered design templates that we go through as part of this cohort to kind of share, okay, here's my institutional knowledge and organizational knowledge on the humanity center design piece. How can we apply that to a stakeholder analysis? How might we apply that to a round robin exercise to get very quick feedback? What somebody in the room last week during cohort 1's final meeting said that having AI in the room to ideate with you feels like a friend because it's somebody else who can propose ideas. And so as you're problem solving and saying, how might we better center Black artists in Pittsburgh? That was one of the questions that came up in the cohort last week. And not only their lived experiences, but historical perspectives that have been brought to the table consistently throughout this region. Um, Perplexity, which is much more powerful than a typical Google search, can give you 5 to 10 outputs. Claude can give you a little bit, lower level, but less detailed output, but it's a place to start. And so rather than having to come up with that first step across the board, that's where AI can be really effective. And then the human expertise that really can't be replicated or replaced is where I think the nonprofit sector is really expert in leveraging that next skill set. Cohort 2 is also applying persuasion and influence. And so I think there's been a lot of conversations around, a development skill set and building donor relationships, or an advocacy skill set and building relationships with elected officials. All of that comes down to persuasion and influence. And so thinking broadly about the value of your organization, the value of the work that you're doing, and framing it in a way that is not based on the language that you use or find most compelling, which we often do, and we often tell the story that we want to tell versus what a person needs to hear as we're making a pitch. Persuasion and influence helps you very quickly identify the person sitting across from you, whether that's a donor, partner, elected official, or volunteer, to identify their reward system and figure out how you can speak their language and say exactly what you find is the solution to the table, or to the problem on the table in front of you both. And so again, this is a sales language and sales marketing, but applying the expertise and the focus of the nonprofit skill set to that persuasion and influence conversation has been huge. And some of the outcomes that we've seen are stronger partnerships where partners are much more clear on the purpose of working with another organization, but also better promoting that so other donors and partners are seeing that work as well. A return on funding requests, and so applying this to sales, there's something around a 70% increase in return on likelihood of a positive next step or reaction, whether that's funding or next meeting or getting to the next phase of partnership. But applying that to the nonprofit sector means we can be that much more effective and efficient in serving the people that we serve. And then finally, cohort 3, and this is where last week on Wednesday, it was designed to be a demo day because of cohort 3. So 4 different organizations, Greater Valley Community Services, Homewood Children's Village, the Department of Human Services Area Agency on Aging, and Community Living and Support Services demoed and introduced the audience to their very first digital employee. And so each of these employees has a job description. And so being launched on a website or in an email signature or on a landing page of a partner's website is a very quick way to create touch points with your organization. And because these are externally facing and are programmed with kind of that persuasion and influence piece in mind, the AI can actually work in the background to identify, what type of stakeholder is reaching out to me in this chat right now. Is it a potential volunteer? Is it a potential funder? Is it somebody who needs services? And the responses, I shared last week that there were 4 different AI tools. If you ask the exact same question worded the exact same way across those 4 tools, you would get 4 very different answers. And the reason is that this AI, because it is ethical and accountable as designed by Mad Labs, it is informed by the voice, tone, and culture of the organization and the people within the organization that are training it. So rather than being another large language model or pulling generic information, this AI is trained on the minutia of your organization and then can be launched 24/7 as a touch point when your human employees are hopefully sleeping and recharging and eating and all the things that we have to do. And so looking at, again, not replacing human employees, but figuring out a way that we can empower human employees to spend more time on the things that we are best best able to do and best suited for. And I'm going to ask a member of my team to drop into the chat our interest link because we have 3 new cohorts. We just got the schedule solidified and we'll be launching the second week of August, I believe, on August 8th. And we'll send a couple of follow-up emails and kind of quick calls to action. Last time when we launched the cohorts, the participants found it very helpful to have 2 information sessions. So one that was kind of a general call-in for anybody who's interested but not really sure if this is the right fit for them, or if they need some support with budgeting for this next step. That's kind of the first information session. The second information session is for the folks who are registered. Before we get into splitting folks into cohort 1s, 2, and 3, how can we kind of level set organization expectations to make sure that, if it's not your executive director participating in this cohort, what types of updates, can we make sure that they're getting throughout this process? What are the things that you need in order to be successful in this cohort? So I do want to offer that we'll be sharing dates in the second and third week of July, just next week and the week after, looking at hosting those information and then more of a planning session on the second one. I'm going to check the chat because I saw a couple of notes come in. Perfect. Thank you so much, Christine, for posting the interest form link. So if there are any questions, I do want to pause there because the next kind of set of updates this morning is going to be more focused on policy. But if there's anybody on the call who, is still kind of questioning, and I see James on the call, I'm not sure if you'd be willing to jump in and share some of the things that you saw last Wednesday or what really resonated with or surprised you in participating in our demo day. And Lawrence, I know you were there as well. Hi, James.
Hi, sure. Hi, friends. Happy Monday. Hope you're all doing well. I appreciated having the opportunity to better understand. I think I have a good connection to AI as it relates to the understanding the internal focused stuff. So, human-centered design, how it can help strategic thinking. I think I have had and have a lot of just not skepticism, but just healthy healthy concern around something that's heavily external facing. But what I really appreciated seeing some of the uses of how it was external facing, but still had humanity, if you know what I mean. And this is mainly just coming from a lot of the frustrations that and I'm sure that we all have in dealing with bots when you're trying to get a problem solved via customer service, whatever. So I that was a takeaway for me of just kind of a learning how it can be a bot, but it still kind of potentially feels like a human, if that makes sense. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for jumping in. Sorry to put you on the spot, but not sorry. We are so happy to have you there last Wednesday. And then Lawrence, I know you've been having, multiple conversations with our team. I'm wondering if there's anything that you're able to come off mute and share. If you're traveling, that's fine. Oh, I see you. Okay. Hello, jump in.
Well, yeah, it's this is really a landmark and kind of epic thing that Forbes Fund is doing because, you know, nonprofits are adrift. Nobody helps us really until we help ourselves. And again, this is a tool that in the for-profit world is really going to be used primarily to advance the objectives of the company, which is fine. That's the free market system we work in. But for nonprofit, which is really the rest of us in our daily lives, somebody's got to be taking responsibility for, again, how AI is used. And it turns out it can be used. It's like any other tool. It can be a help or a hindrance. And I think Forbes Fund is really taking the lead, maybe even nationally. I don't know. I'm going to do a little research on that, but Pittsburgh has been the start of so much innovative thinking and revolutionary thinking, really throughout the last 2 centuries in terms of work and labor, and occasionally it gets used really for a good beneficial cause. I think that's happening here. Yeah, I've been really looking over the last few years, artificial intelligence. You bookmarked the little articles are like kind of ominous and foreboding. And then you say, why doesn't somebody do something about this? And Forbes Fund is doing it. And I think, again, the cohorts at some point should figure out really how to keep spreading this gospel, so to speak, that AI can be used, for really helping people. And I think that's really where it's at right now. And it's just a good thing. That's all I can say. It's
Thanks,
looking good.
Lawrence. No, I
Yeah.
appreciate it. Any questions from folks who weren't able to join us or, this is their first call since we've been talking about the cohorts? If not, I'm happy to turn it over to Fred, because I know he shared the closing remarks, during demo day Wednesday, just to kind of put this project in perspective of, broader trends. So Fred, I'd like to invite you to share some of that today as well.
Thank you. I think it's important. I think James and James, I really appreciate your trepidation. We've been doing presentations across the state for the past year, and I've facilitated probably almost in every region of the state. I've asked a question about people's fear and adoption of AI. And I was astonished at the number of people who, in some regions, saw AI as the Terminator and Skynet. And so for me, there's certain things when you think about inflection points that are here. AI is here. Chat GPT, Mentally, and other things are being programmed by people, some local source, some not local source, that reflect a implicit bias in the programmer's ideology that mitigates the ability to infuse cultural context that's relevant across race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic strata. Given that the tool that we've co-created with Mad Labs is one that we believe pioneers the sector's ability to tell a story from a context that's reflective of its organization's ethos, its history, its culture, its context. Secondly, the trilateral way by which we obtain data through our tool is different and unique than other tools, as well as this constant learning phase, which allows every organization to optimize the collective gifts, skills, and talents of its staff and team when used in a strategic and pragmatic way. I would dare say that most of us have handheld computers in our hand, which are our phones, and 90% of us just make phone calls and use them for text and answer emails, but they have so much more power. AI will revolutionize the way we do work. The impetus for us is, since I've been out to seat for the past 6 years, we have been intentional about designing programs that ensure a balanced and restorative justice framework for small and outerline nonprofits who are competing against the greater, I would call brick, the giant brick kind of organizations that existed or exist in our communities. And I'll use this term a lot, brick and mortar. There are certain organizations that are brick and mortar that are the bricks that we look at, Boys and Girls Club, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, youth places in some cases. Like, these are organizations that get resources, that need to have resources to do meaningful work. But the smaller organizations like Jada House, Healthy Village Learning Institute, and others are the mortar. They're the people and organizations that hold the bricks together. They're the people in the community that have their pulse on the problems in the community. And what we've designed is a tool to help raise those organizations' ability to compete in the 21st century global economy using Pittsburgh as a platform. Certainly, people can opt out of participating. That's their choice. But like the horse and buggy that got moved to the car, the Model T, at some point things get replaced. And you can maintain your desire and affinity for a thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But for me, when I see the dichotomy, when I see the lag that exists between organizations that can, for example, show up at a development meeting training that we're doing, and one organization sends 3 development people, and the other one sends their ED, who's their development person, their spokesperson, and fundraiser, and also teaching class, there's no comparison. And so we designed the AI tool to create that kind of capacity. And I'm excited about the early findings that Emily alluded to, because the impetus was, we don't ever see our work as replacing human beings. We see our work as an additive to enhance the skills, gifts, and talents of human beings so that they can build sustainable relationships, explore new opportunities, and in some cases help build the bench so that they can bring in new talent. That cannot be done if you don't have a pathway by which your day-to-day operations are being managed. And so for us, the development of our AI tool was to create a tool that created task-laden activities that got executed by the AI to allow smaller and emerging organizations to explore building deeper and more meaningful relationships that aren't transactional. And I want to say that this does not work, in my opinion, if you function transactionally. Our 4th pivot was this focus on moving from systems change to ecosystems co-creation. And the focus there was, how do we get the myriad of nonprofits in Southwestern PA to think about yourselves like a train on a track? And each car on the train did a specific thing, but like on the commuter train, you can walk between one train and the other, right? How do people optimize what they bring to the train as the building block of the human spirit to develop a humanity-centered design approach that people can transition through the train while it's on course towards its destination? That's a concurrent process. If we think about that train as a continuum from preconception to career, and all of the nonprofits that exist in Southwestern PA, it seems prudent to me that we would reduce the duplication of cars that did the same thing and increase those cars' ability to be effective and efficient. And through that, we would generate a higher rate of return on the investment we're making in human beings, that they would be transformed along the way, as opposed to having a single experience with the organization that in many cases, there's not a pre and post connection to absorb or help that person absorb what else is possible. And so that humanity-centered design approach is a holistic perspective. This takes into account the built environment, education, healthcare, affordable housing. And so when you look at these notions and the role of technology, how are we creating intentionally a framework to do that that also respects the difference across race, ethnicity, social economic strata, religion, given where we are in the world? And so when Lauren says that we are pioneering a new process, we're breaking the mold in many ways of traditional practices. I dare say, since I've been in this seat, nobody's ever asked me why we're in our sixth pivot, which I find interesting. And why would one pivot? One would pivot because you want to position your organization to be in the best position to take advantage of what's in front of it, while also being aware of what's on the side of it and behind it. And so these pivots that we're making, that you can look at historically and see, they have all been with the impetus to increase our ability to serve you and our region. Not about us, but about you. But in every relationship, if you don't arrive fully present and vulnerable to take advantage of the opportunity, it's missed. Why did we do this? And I'll close with this. I burdened my team with moving at 30, 60, and 90-day increments. I talked to corporations and they're astonished at our theory of change. I believe that the nonprofit ecosystem has to figure out how to better collaborate with governmental agencies, healthcare systems, corporations, small businesses, and other entities to create a healthy, vibrant ecosystem. Far too long, we function independent of everybody else and ask for resources from them to support a trajectory that wasn't inclusive of the entire region's forecast. We've done that for years. And so we pushed back on that notion, and we profited that no single organization can solve today's problems by themselves. As we began to push that out, what we saw was that there was a chasm between high-performing organizations and those who were in I would say, survival mode and doing important work. And nobody is saying that the work wasn't important or are they not skilled. But when you have one person that's writing the grants, driving the van, teaching the kids, doing presentations, and you have another organization that sent 3 development people to a training, you have a different core capacity of organization's ability to function at a high level. And so the tool that we share with you that Emily is leading is really about a tool that we think builds the ability of smaller nonprofits and mid-sized nonprofits to compete in Pittsburgh and into the 21st century global economy. So Emily's work in the 3 cohorts represent a cross-sector of organizations at different resource levels. And so we were intentional about doing that as well. And I will close with change is inevitable, growth is optional. You can choose to look at what's happening, which I call situational awareness. You can choose to function in 30, 60, 90-day increments. We believe, well, I do, that if you can't proffer an idea in 30 days, it might not be worth putting out in the universe. If you can't solidify and test it through rapid prototyping in 60 days, one might question its validity. And if you can't radically infuse it in 90 days, then one got to question how important is it at this moment. That does not mean the idea doesn't have value. In this moment, does it meet the need of the sector? And that's why we function like we do. And so the essence of this work was to help build the sector's ability to also better collaborate with us as an intermediary, because in many cases, when we ask to partner with organizations, they're interested in the concepts that we proffer, but they don't have the infrastructure to keep pace with the way we move. And they think that they do, and this is no slight to the organization. As a leader, I often go into a meeting as the leader thinking my team can do X. And I'll come back and Olivia will say, well, we can't do that. In my mind, I'm thinking we can. But at the end of the day, she's like, well, you got this, you got this, you got this. We could do it, but it would not be done well. And so leaders often go into a space and they see an idea and they're like, we got to have that. The reality is, can we do it now? And so this tool that's been created gives us the ability to look at the now, right? And optimize the now to create real systemic change in our region. Eckhart Tolle talks about the power of now. He says there's 3 critical functionalities. People who look to the future dwell on the past and don't address the present. And so what we've created is a tool that allows us to be present, understanding the past, but focus on the present and the future through a trajectory that looks at humanity as the center of our work and not a thing. In 2019, when the city of Pittsburgh was designated as one of 15 national and 33 international cities that received the 100 Resilient Cities Award from the Rockefeller Foundation, we pleaded with the city to put more resources into humans and not just buy tools. At the end of the day, even you can have 1,000 tools. A human being has to operate the tool. If we don't build the user interface of the human to optimize the tool is useless. And so today we've provided with you a framework to produce this work at a higher level to create some parity in the nonprofit ecosystem. But the impetus is really everybody on this call has a chance to be great. And Jim Collins talks about good to great. This is an opportunity to create a flywheel concept for your organization while also assessing, do you have the right people on the bus and are they in the right seat? We all have to do this, every one of us, even us. And so I share that with you, and I will stop and pause and be open for questions, comments, or concerns. But I can tell you this, AI is here. If we don't get involved with it and contextualize it, it will have implicit bias. And it is my goal and my intent that we do as much as humanly possible to ensure cross-sectoral representation of generative AI as it reflects humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. I didn't see any questions come through in the chat as Fred was sharing the history and context, giving a lot of forward-looking focus to these AI cohorts as well. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. I'm going to go ahead and go into the policy update because last week was a lot for folks who are following the presidential debates, but also other things happening at the executive level regarding at the federal level, I'm sorry, regarding the Supreme Court. There are kind of a lot of things to keep an eye on right now. And so I want to just kind of give a preliminary overview and share that our next Public Policy Committee meeting will be the 18th of this month and encourage you to join. This is a space where GPNP members across mission areas, but also folks, outside of our sector come in and offer insight and expertise. This past week, we discussed the focus on more like legislative visits and outreach. One of our affinity groups, the GPNP, focusing specifically on work with senior centers, has resulted in incredible relationship building. And I want to have a future community call going into that collaboration, led by the DHS Area Agency on Aging and Excelsior Consulting. But it also brings to light that these collaborations take a lot of work. That is a 6-month partnership at this point. And, point in time connections like the Public Policy Committee meeting are dependent on, or their value is dependent on expertise being in the room at the right time. And so I want to encourage folks to attend those meetings and share, from your part of the sector, what are the policy issues that you're seeing really come to a head? As a reminder, our priorities this year, as determined by the summit in 2023, are on broadband policy, because as you know from the Appropriations Committee summaries, but also the overview from the governor's budget, there's not any sort of state funding dedicated towards broadband expansion, and the ARPA funds and bipartisan infrastructure law funds that have been able to be leveraged, that landscape is going to change. And so as we're having conversations about AI and digital literacy and machine learning and all of the things that are required to have a thriving economy, we need to have the infrastructure in place that actually makes that so. Environment, there have been multiple conversations around what green means in various meetings that I've been a part of, and everything from again, federal decisions that allow the EPA to offer guidance on safe water and clean energy, all the way to global impacts and global warming and climate change. There's a lot of different different focuses under each policy bucket. And so again, having the Public Policy Committee right size the GPNP response and partnerships that we need to pursue to put us in a good position in Southwest PA to be able to tackle policy, but also advocate effectively for the nonprofits that are affected by it is really critical. So I mentioned broadband, environment, education, housing, workforce development, and mental health supports, especially within the sector, but also the larger cliff that was really brought to a head during the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a huge need for mental health supports at so many different levels. And again, with the Appropriations Committee listening sessions, it was clear that in the budget, I believe it's 20 million dedicated towards mental health for this budget cycle that's proposed, with an increase to 60 million for the next cycle and following. But we know that the convening of county commissioners early, I think it was January of this year, estimated that the need for Pennsylvania was somewhere closer to 250 million, in addition to county-based funding. And so again, highlighting the need, telling stories, having data, and bringing those to conversations. This is, the public policy committees are where we, design the strategy that we can implement month to month. And Debbie, I saw your hand go up. Did you want to come off mute real quick? Maybe not. All right. So looking into some specific policy updates. So for anybody who tuned in for the debate last Thursday, trying to find an adequate synopsis that went through the policy side, but also kind of like party priorities was really difficult. And so I did want to share in the research for this week what the most common takeaways from last week's debate were. Number one, and this is beyond the policy pieces, one, is President Biden really the best Democratic nominee at this point? Interestingly enough, this is the earliest scheduled debate in U.S. history before an election. And part of the thinking is that, because the national conventions have not yet taken place, multiple names have been thrown around for a potential different nominee, including Governor Shapiro from Pennsylvania. And just keeping an eye on who the best Democratic nominees are. I think there are 5 names that I saw most commonly. Governor Newsom from California, but looking at what their policy priorities are and what might position them as a good nominee is really important at this point. There have also been a lot of publications saying that, President Biden is going to is going to continue to be the nominee because the administration and the policies that he's supporting, make that the best or the strongest kind of chance for Democrats. The other side, the other takeaway is that the format of the debate on Thursday really benefited former President Trump. There were some erroneous claims made on both sides, but particularly from President Trump, a lot of the fact check analyses following the debate highlighted discrepancies in data, but also kind of broader claims that were made. And so a lack of live fact checking that has been, hosted or provided for debates in the past, like on the screen, wasn't helpful for President Biden. It really benefited former President Trump because all of the fact checking kind of came after the fact. And the other piece was that former President Trump has a stronger stage presence. There were a lot of even body language analyses, which again, when we were researching to provide the updates from today, and I was really looking for policy resources, and the purpose of a debate is really trying to figure out what are you going to get if each candidate is elected. And the analyses were more so on body language and stage presence. And so it's just kind of a bizarre place we find ourselves in the US. Anybody who was on Instagram or Threads or X, I'm sure saw some crazy memes, entertaining, but really daunting as well. And the sum was really that neither party is super happy with their nominee at this point, based on the discussions during the debate and the comments made, but also, in comparisons to past presidents and debates that have, taken place since they were televised. So again, it's easy to feel a little crestfallen this week. That's okay. Especially, given the future leader of our country. The two candidates that we have are the two candidates we have. And so keeping up to date on policy priorities and what we can expect from each administration is going to be critical. And so for this week, I'm focusing on foreign policy and campaign analysis. Some of this was touched on during the debate on Thursday, but not all of it. Just kind of drawing a clear kind of focus of each presidential candidate on each of these issues. So number one, with foreign policy, possibly the most, kind of broad summary is that President Biden is focusing on global partnerships, particularly through NATO, versus former President Trump focus on an isolationist America first policy and priority. With technology and AI, this was a really interesting dichotomy between the two that we found. So, President Biden is supporting the expansion of AI as a need for national security, but also really clear on the need for governance and oversight of what that needs to look like. And this is in line with his economic impact agenda around monopolies and really challenging their power and hegemony. And then former President Trump really put a focus on the expansion of AI as an opportunity to put a flag in the ground in the race against China, which is very it's a little bit different than the stance on China that has been communicated. So there's the diplomatic relation, but also the kind of global presence that the United States, China, other powers typically have. And so the two-part stance on China for President Biden is focusing on a national security threat and a need to separate the economy from dependence on Chinese technologies or services. With President Trump, in addition to the advancement of AI and technology as a need and a national security focus, there's also a focus on trade workers, and again, separating the national security threat from economic dependence to benefit, again, that America first focus of many of his policies. And I'll get more into this in domestic policy pieces and trade a little bit later, but the two candidates are a little bit more in line in terms of stance in China, at least at a high level, versus some of their other policy areas. With climate change, we'll see probably the starkest difference. President Biden has a focus of climate change and combating climate change through green energy policies as a pillar of his policy, domestic and foreign. And former President Trump has an expansion proposed to sectors like oil, coal, gas that have the largest environmental or negative environmental impacts. And so looking at the focus on climate change as a as the purpose, decreasing the carbon footprint is President Biden's focus, and former President Trump's focus is more on the economic viability of the sectors or the value of the sectors that have an impact on climate change and rolling back restrictions that would allow them to continue to expand. 5, global defense and NATO. I mentioned this a little bit earlier with the isolationist policy versus partnerships. President Biden is a champion of NATO and multilateral cooperation versus President Trump has a criticism of people not paying their fair share or having as much power to leverage if there is a conflict and partnership threat, and wants to withdraw from NATO. With fiscal policy, and this is again foreign fiscal policy, energy and infrastructure focus, growing the middle class, and a challenge to monopolies is President Biden's focus. A lot of these talking points around growing the middle class are pretty consistent with what we heard with President Obama when Biden was vice president. And then for former President Trump, a focus on tax cuts and deregulatory policies that would allow corporations to continue to expand. Global health. President Biden has rejoined the World Health Organization and committed to pandemic relief packages and making sure that information and testing are widely available. Former President Trump kind of inherited the COVID-19 pandemic pretty early on in his presidency, and there had been restrictions rolled back on pandemic preparedness prior to COVID really surging and impacting a lot of Americans. And he would continue to kind of forward that policy, focusing on, what is the purpose of funding that is for healthcare, and proposing a withdrawal from the World Health Organization. So not necessarily pandemic preparedness and relief, but if there are other funds coming in for healthcare that could be going towards abortion. He has been outspokenly against, the opportunity to get that funding on principle of the funding purpose versus what could be leveraged with access to those funds. On immigration, both candidates have cited immigration reform as a pillar of their foreign policy. For President Biden, the focus is on expanding protections and doing a root cause analysis on the purpose of immigration and why we have so many individuals seeking American citizenship. For former President Trump, he also seeks to reshape asylum and border policy, but it's for the purpose of cracking down or decreasing immigration, regardless of whether or not it's legal or illegal, which we heard pretty consistently throughout his presidency as well. Number 10, focus on the Middle East. Thank you, Bree, for launching the poll. As I'm closing out the foreign policy piece, please respond to the poll so we can bring in some speakers that can address, the most important issues to you, but, also for the nonprofit sector. And we also have a couple of questions on the AI and strategic design in a box resources in our poll today. So for the Middle East, we know that the handling of the conflict in Gaza has been a talking point and a kind of a divisive topic for even supporters of President Biden. At this point, he's proposing a ceasefire and a two-state solution. This is in contrast with the beginning of the conflict, where a lot of the weapons were coming from the U.S. In favor of Israel, and President Trump is outspokenly supporting Israel and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East as partners to the United States. In terms of Russia-Ukraine conflict, President Biden has committed to continuing to back Ukraine in their defensive efforts and has put sanctions on Russia. President Trump has not committed to additional aid to Ukraine should he be elected, but there are a couple of instances where he has sanctioned Russia, despite having a better relationship with Putin than the US has typically had in the past. And finally, on trade, President Biden has proposed subsidy programs for infrastructure and technology, again in line with AI and technology focus and economic focus, for his foreign economic policies, to build up manufacturing and really strengthening the middle class. And former President Trump has been focusing on tariffs and writing trade deficits against US interests. And so again, that America First policy is really the foundation for former President Trump's policies, whether that's, economic relationships, commitments to conflicts, or supporting certain entities in various regions of globally, and really writing the stance of America as an isolationist focus for the country. I'm not going to get too much into the Supreme Court decisions today just because we were a little short on time. But basically, the two decisions that were made last week, one would end Chevron deference, which really just makes it difficult for experts and agencies at the executive level to weigh in on the intent of a policy. So the Chevron deference that was put into place in 1980, I believe, or 1984, was put in place as a protective measure because there were lower courts that were utilizing their own preference to impact how policy was implemented. So the Chevron deference removes the role of the judiciary in terms of policy interpretation when it comes from Congress. And as something is written, removing the Chevron deference allows the Supreme Court to make judgments when there is ambiguity at the judiciary level versus those decisions being made by experts within executive agencies. And so there are a lot of questions around the balance of power between the three branches of government right now. And I'm sure we'll see more coming up on this, which is why I kind of saved it for last. And I'll get into this more next week. And then the second decision is the Supreme Court decision focusing on housing, specifically rights of homeless individuals versus rights of cities to be able to break up encampments. And this was the Grants Pass versus Johnson decision. There were a lot of cities throughout the US that were describing their situation as kind of no teeth when it comes to enforcing encampment policies. And the decision puts that power back in the hands of cities. However, advocates for individuals who are unhoused or experiencing homelessness are calling for a need to focus on supports and resources if those encampments are being broken up. What other types of supports and resources can be given to the individuals that have an easier pathway to being criminalized for being homeless at this point. So again, I'll get into this more in the domestic policy from the presidential debate a little bit next week. But again, this week really served as a point in time update on Forbes Fund's ecosystem updates, but also there's a lot going on. So take care of yourself this week. Continue to stay informed on conversations happening at the federal and state level as we're supporting the regional connections, and I look forward to seeing you next Monday. Thank you so much for joining us.